Now, are the kids going to come back? Oh, good, because I want to, we have big kids, but I'd like some little kids too. It's a tradition. Certainly is, I was born in Los Angeles and I lived in California when I was a little kid. And it was part of the tradition, part of the school system, part of just culturally. Just like in India, you have Ram Leela, and you tell the story of Ram, and various other traditions as well. You tell that story. Well, the same thing is true in America as well. Is that every Christmas season, it was always very special. Now, I have to admit, when I was a little kid, I didn't know too much about Jesus Christ, but I knew the stories, and I learned a good lesson in the years since that. Even as a teacher, I've learned that when the class is over, people don't remember much about the philosophy, honestly, a little bit. I hope a little bit more sometimes, but I know they do remember a story. And the fact of being able to pass on tradition through the medium of story and adventure and those sorts of things is something common to all cultures. All traditions do this, and isn't it so? We remember those things that were told to us perhaps as we were kids. We remember those stories. Well, it's the same thing. And Christmas was like that for me, and I think in America, most little kids, of course, they remember the fellow in the red suit too, but who comes with the gifts. But we remember those stories, and they would be every year. It was never old. It would be retold again, that story. And in Christmas, of course, we tell the story of Jesus Christ and his birth. Not so much the philosophy that goes beyond that, but certainly his birth. But I want to talk a little bit. I'm going to address some of this first part of what we're talking about tonight, more to the kids. Big kids too, but more so if I'm aiming over here talking to this group, it's because I'm going to interact a little with them. And then as we go along, I'll kind of shift my focus over to the bigger kids. But I want to ask some of you kids, can one of you tell me what is Christmas about? We're remembering something, and what is it that we're trying to remember? Okay, Christ. And his adventures, what part of it? His old age? No, his birth, of course. We're remembering the story of Christ's birth. Now, does any one of you, now you sound like you're smart here, but does anybody remember where Christ was born? Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem's a little town. He's even today, it's not a big town, but it's in those days, of course, a very little town. And Christ, Jesus, his parents, he wasn't born yet. His parents were on the way journeying to the big city of Jerusalem. They had to go there because the government required something, and they had to go there. But unfortunately for their journey, and fortunately for everybody else, Mary was pregnant, and she was about to have a baby. And it was getting close. And they were getting closer and closer to Jerusalem, but they couldn't make it to Jerusalem. So one night, she was about to give birth. And Joseph, who is Mary's husband, goes and tries to find a place for them to stay for the night, because she was going to have a baby. And what they do, they don't have any place to stay. The inns, the hotels in those days, they were full. And where were they going to stay? And finally, one person gives them an idea, say, well, I have a stable out back. You know what a stable is? What is that? It's like a barn. Yeah, it's like a barn. And a place where cattle or the animals stay. And he says, it has a roof, so you could be out of the weather and you could stay there. And so Mary and Joseph go back there, and that night, there's strange things begin to happen in the countryside around Bethlehem. Lights begin to appear in the sky, And in the fields, there's sheep and shepherds. They begin to hear voices, and there's these angelic beings begin to appear and call to go to Bethlehem, because a child has been born. Not any child, a special child has been born. And to go there and worship this child. And they followed those instructions and they went to that. Now you see here, this is this is a very traditional thing that is often, and people put up, they have this, and every Christmas they'll make these, and this is called a nativity scene. It's got a fancy French word saying a crèche. I don't know what that means, but this is called a crèche. And this shows all of what's going on there. You've got these angels here, and you've got the shepherds, and you've got Mary and Joseph, and you've got the little baby Jesus, and you've got the cows, and you've got the donkey. Oh, but you've got these three other guys here too. Now, what are those other three? Three wise, and they were called Magi, right? Is that? No. Magi. I don't know how to pronounce that. They were wise men, prophets maybe, and they had come from a long distance away. Some people say they even came from India. Now this is taking place in Jerusalem, or in Bethlehem, which is a long way from here. And some people say maybe they came from Persia, India, and they had come a long way, and they knew they had been, because they were very wise, they knew that a special baby was going to be born. And so they came to find it, but they didn't quite know how to find it. Where was this going to happen? And does any one of you know how they were able to find this place? No, you're too smart. They found it because there was a star. This is how the story goes, that there was a star. Let's see, like that. Maybe shining. Maybe it was like that. You see, who knows? The star was said to be shining in the sky. Now this was a wonderful story, and it has many different ways that you can interpret that. But these kings also are said to have come, and there were three, and they had gifts to come. They had come to find that child and to give that child gifts and to worship that child, because it had been foretold that this would be a great soul, a master who would lead many, many souls to freedom. In today's world, what we would say, we'd call this person an avatar. And he had come and been born there. And they were wise to know that. So they brought three gifts. Now, this is a hard one. Now, wait a minute. Now don't you be quiet. We got Christian's too quick here. They brought three gifts. Does any of you younger ones know what one of those gifts was? Okay. Okay, gold. Now she picked the easy one, I think. Gold. Now gold, that represents wealth, you know.
He was descended from a royal family.
Yeah, Joseph was. Yes, he was. And so they brought gold, and they gave him gold. Now there's two more gifts. Now, if anybody can get these next two, I'm going to give you a special congratulations. Anybody knows the second one? Okay, now I'll give you a hint. You know, sometimes you light something, and it gives off smoke. It's incense. It's like incense, but it was called frankincense, which is incense. It has a beautiful smell to it, and it was very costly. And that was the second one. Then the third one, now this is the hard one, it was called myrrh. And myrrh was a very, very expensive oil that you put on your body. Special times you put it on. And so they brought these three gifts to them, and then what happened is then they left. Now, They were looking, the king in those days was a man named Herod, and he had met these three wise men because when they were looking for Jesus, they went to the king and says, "Where is this great king that's supposed to be born?" And Herod was, "A king is born here." And he became afraid because he saw that maybe this young child would be born and grow up to be his rival. And so he wanted to know because he wanted to kill that child. So he asked the wise men, he says, "Go, find this child, and then come back to me and tell me where he is so that I can go worship him too." But you see, he was an evil king. And so the wise men, in a dream, they knew that's what Herod wanted. And so instead of going back to the king, they went back to their home country. And Jesus, later on, he escapes. They escape with his family, and they go to another country, Egypt. And this story has many different important messages. And one of them, of course, is this giving of gifts. Now, there are two primary. He grew up, of course, Christ grew up and delivered a message to people. And there were two main points. Now, people make religion very complicated, but it's really not all that complicated. It's actually quite simple. The core of it is simple. And he had two main points of what Christianity is all about. And somebody asked him, Christ later, when he was an adult, said, "What is the highest duty? What's the greatest commandment that a person should adhere to?" And he said, "Love the Lord thy God with all thy soul, all thy heart, all thy mind, and all thy strength." That's the greatest commandment. To love God is what Jesus' message was. It was simple. He said, "Love God." But then he said a second one, and there is a second one, like onto it. "Love thy neighbor as thyself." Now, these two, very simple. Love God, and in a sense, see God in everybody else around you. And if you adhere to those two, you'll be my true disciples. If you do those two things. And that message is the message that has been spoken of throughout the ages by every great saint and teacher, spiritual teacher. That's the core of the message of spirituality in this age, to love God and to love thy neighbor as thyself. Now, a little after that second story, but one of the people in the audience asks, "Well, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor?" Because in those days, you love some people as your neighbor, but "You're my neighbor, she's not my neighbor." So you had a neighbor. Who is going to be your neighbor? And people in those days, they lived in groups. My neighbor is somebody who's part of my group, but in that other group, they're not my neighbor. There is a divide. So one fellow asks him, says, "Well, who's my neighbor that I should love?" And he tells a story. He says, one day, there was a man going to market, and he was walking through the fields, and he was accosted, or he was jumped on by a robber. And the robber was a strong man, and the robber takes all of his possessions, and not only that, he beats him up. He beats him and breaks his bones probably, and he throws him into a ditch on the side of the road. And there he is in the ditch and can't get out, all beat up, lost all his possessions, and he's crying for help. And a man walks by and hears him crying for help and he's in the ditch. And he walks on, he sees him, he says, well, I don't want to help him. You know what, I'm late for my appointment. He looked at his watch. They didn't have watches in those days. But I'm late, I have something important to do, I'm hungry, I have to go eat lunch, whatever it was. He says, and he went on. And he left the fellow in the ditch. Well, the fellow in the ditch was crying. And then another one comes back. And the second man that comes back is a priest in the temple, a holy man, supposed to be. He comes by, and he says, help me, help me. He sees him there, and he walks right on by. He says, oh no, it's time. It's time for the service to begin. Sunday Satsang is starting. Sunday Satsang, I can't be late. And plus, there's all those people, and if I help you, I'm going to get stuck with you. I'm going to have to take you to the hospital. I'm going to have to do everything, and I'm going to be bothered. So he passes by. So, and the man's still in the ditch. And finally, a third fellow finally comes by. Now this guy, the first two guys were part of the fellow in the ditch's community. Finally, a third guy comes by, and he was an outsider. He was, in those days, there was tribes of people, and he belonged to the tribe which is called the Samaritan tribe, as opposed to the Judean tribe. So he belonged to the Samaritans. Now, have you ever heard the word, somebody tells you should be a good Samaritan? Now, no, someday you will, because of this story. Now, to be a good Samaritan, well, the Samaritan comes by. Now, he doesn't belong to their tribe. And he's actually considered unclean, somebody to be avoided, somebody to be, despised even. So he comes, and the man in the ditch says, help me, help me. And the Samaritan stops, and he goes in the ditch. He gets the man out of the ditch, patches him up, helps him, gives him money so that he could get food and lodging at the next, takes him to the village, and so he fixes him. And then, so Jesus is telling this story to the person who asked, who's my neighbor? So he asked the man who asked that question, who do you think the man in the ditch considered to be his true friend and neighbor of those three people? And the man says, well, of course, it was a Samaritan. And Jesus says only a little bit to him. He says, be thou likewise. In other words, your neighbor is really whoever is standing in front of you at any time in your life. We all have people that we feel close to, but when we say, love thy neighbor, what that means is, who is my neighbor? My neighbor who is ever standing right in front of me at that moment in life. Love that person in the same way that I love myself. Feel your oneness with that person. And these two principles, love God and love thy neighbor, other people, is the foundation of what, and Christ says, on these two principles rest all the prophets and the law. And if we can abide by those two things, this is what it means to be a Christian. Somebody, of course, who loves Christ, but also somebody who loves that which Christ taught, those two things, and to share. And this tradition has been passed down from to us in here. Look, oh, what's under that tree? Presents. That symbolizes everybody here sharing what they had to you. And it's remembrance, this is a remembrance of Christ's birth, remembering the gifts that the kings gave, but also remembering that principle of sharing what we have not just it's not just physical things, it's sharing our love, our caring, our reaching out, building bridges to other people, who we are, reaching out. It represents that. Now, when I was a kid, I didn't think of any of this, what I told you. I just remembered the gifts. That was it. And now I look into this creche, this scene, and I don't see a tree in there like that. And there's one character that's missing. Somebody's missing from that creche scene. But this is Jaya at this age. Who's missing? Santa Claus. Well, where's he? Where's he? No, of course, Santa wasn't part of that story. But the story of Santa, I'll tell you the story of Santa Claus, where he came from. Jesus was born about 2,000 years ago. That's a long time. But his story has still been told year after year after year until now. Well, about 300 years after he was born, his message of sharing, loving people, this had begun to spread to many people, and groups of people, Christian centers, Christian churches began to form, and the leader of one of these, it was in the town. Does any of you know, have you heard of the country that's now called Turkey? Okay, it's a long ways from here, but it's a country called Turkey. There's a city in Turkey called Myra. Well, this man was the leader of all of the Christian people in that city of Myra, and his name was, anybody want to guess? Nicholas. Now, and he became known as Saint Nicholas because he was a very saintly man. And the story goes that one day Nicholas was walking down the street, and because he was the leader of that group of Christians there, he tried to keep in touch with everybody and know what their needs were. And he passed one house, and he heard a husband and a wife lamenting. They were sad in that house. And I know it's not proper to eavesdrop with people, but he couldn't help but go listen. What was their problem? They were very sad. Well, they had 2 daughters. And when the daughter was about to get married, they had no money for her marriage. And no dowry, no nothing to put on the marriage. And they were very, very sad about this. And they wanted to have a nice wedding for their daughter, and they had no money. They were kind of like the shoemakers. They had nothing. Well, they were lamenting. And so Nicholas heard this. And so that night, Nicholas, he snuck up to their house, and one version is he threw a little bag of gold coins in the window, and he snuck away without anybody knowing. And the next day, the people, the 2 husband and wife, came out, and they found this bag of money, of gold coins. And they were so happy they could provide for their daughter's wedding just perfectly. Well, a little bit of time went by, and the second daughter, same thing happened. And they had no money, and Nicholas came to hear about this. But this time, I'll say the other version, he came and he climbed up on the roof. And it's cold there in the winter, and they have a fireplace in their house, and so the chimney goes up. He went up on the roof, and he dropped the gold coin bag down the chimney, and it landed in there. Now, but it didn't land on the ground. Because the chimney, it was people would hang their stockings in the fireplace to dry. And the gold went down and landed in the stocking. But the next day, they found it. And eventually, but nobody knew who dropped it there. But eventually, somebody had seen Nicholas do this, and the story began to spread. And he was a very generous man, well respected. He became known as Saint Nicholas. Well, eventually, time passes, and Nicholas things begin to change. Stories change over the years, and Saint Nicholas ended up being also known as a nickname for Saint Nicholas is Saint Nick. I don't know if you've ever heard of that name, which is, in another language, saint, it became Santa, and Nicholas became Claus. It became Santa Claus. Now, how he ended up at the North Pole and how he ended up with reindeer, that's a whole other story, which I'm not going to take the time to tell, but he did. Now, how he became, in those days, leaders of the church would wear garments of red and white. And St. Nicholas, of course, St. Nick, Santa Claus, wears red and white. But the symbol here is sharing, giving of gifts, reaching out to your neighbor, helping the neighbor in times of need. That's the spirit behind Christmas. But coming back to all of us, we have to remember Christ was an avatar. He came with a mission to free many souls, but he also came with a mission to reach out and spread a new teaching, a teaching that was based upon love, a teaching that went beyond merely rules and regulations, is how religion had begun to be practiced in those days. In other words, to always look for the spirit rather than the rule. The spirit of love, follow the spirit of love rather than just the rule. And you could say, just as Swami would say, is one of the guiding principles of Ananda, people are more important than things. People are more important than rules and regulations. The needs of people from the heart, and to reach out with the heart and to touch people on that level is, in a sense, expressed in the spirit of Christmas, of sharing, loving one another, loving one's neighbor. But on a deeper level also we understand that baby Krishna represented that Christ consciousness, that consciousness of oneness with God, that is the potential for each one of us. And so Christmas as a holiday comes once a year. But really, Christmas in spirit should be every day. Every day should be Christmas. Christmas in the sense of each of us opening our heart, lifting ourselves to become aware and express and experience the Christ consciousness in our life. This is what Christmas reminds us. So we have this holiday, this season once a year, but let's all make it a point, make it an affirmation that every day becomes Christmas in the sense of living in that Christ consciousness, and two, expressing the ideals of what Christmas is actually meant to be. A sharing of the joy that we feel. These two principles in every religion. See, this message is not confined to one culture or one tradition. It's a universal message, and this is what avatars bring. They bring a universal message. Just like the message of the avatars of India are not limited merely to this one culture. They're universal messages. Avatar brings such messages. And this principle is inherent and to be found in every true religion. Love God and share that love with all. Because if we don't share, it withers on the vine. the vine that is not fed. And so those two always go together. And sometimes people, it's like Sri Yukteswar said to Yogananda when he asked him to go and start a school and take up a spiritual message. He says, and Yogananda was a little bit, oh, I don't want to do that. Leaders are always criticized. As he said, you can never do right one way or the other. And Yukteswarji just said to him, he says, do you want to keep all of the divine chana simply for yourself? And it's no, because if you do, if you keep whatever blessings that have come to you, and all of us in some way or another are blessed, if we keep those blessings strictly to ourselves, eventually the flow of those blessings that come into us will dry up. And so it's imperative for us to be a channel and to be an instrument for sharing those blessings with others. Something Swami Kriyananda used to repeat to us again and again and again. He said, Christ came not, and as all great avatars, all great saints do, he came in that same spirit, not to show us how great he was. The great ones come to show us how great each of us can eventually and ultimately be. They come to show us our potential, and that potential must be sooner or later realized. Christ is an example of one such great soul. So when we think of Christmas, we read his teachings, look in this, don't keep him at a distance. Realize what he is sharing with us is the message and the potential for each one of us to become unified and united in God in that consciousness of Christ. So many blessings to all of you, and I'm wishing you a happy Christmas. And thank all of you kids. That was a great play. I really enjoyed it. And I think you will remember in years to come. You will forget, let me say first, everything I've said. Probably, if you're like me. But you may remember that tree, and you may remember that play you put on, and you may remember, yeah, we had fun. And I think that carry that with you and share that joy that you feel today. And within whatever the presence you get, share that with your friends and share that with everybody, and share those memories with ultimately your kids when you grow up to be big like some of us here. Joy to all of you. And joy to you too, the big kids in the audience.